Thank you
Okay.
for joining us today.
Thank
Also
you.
joining us is Bobby Rand to discuss whether states can borrow their way out of their fiscal crisis. We will specifically be discussing his home state of New Jersey. Bobby has had 2 tours in the New Jersey State Treasurer's Office in the early 1990s and in the mid 2000s, and was a local countywide bond issuer and manager, bond issuer manager for about 10 years. He was instrumental in creating the New Jersey's tax credit incentives.
The originals.
Concept 30 years ago, and helped develop project financing techniques and mechanisms. Thank you so much for joining me today, Bobby, and I look forward to our discussion. And also thank you for sharing your experience and expertise there in New Jersey.
Well, if I may, I am trying to channel the voice and vision of the late and legendary state treasurer, Cliff Goldman, because I developed a lot of this with him. He was a fiscal titan for 50 years. I don't know if I can measure up, but I'll try to carry it on the best I can.
Well, I appreciate that. And so, as you know, Truth in Accounting, we do a 50-state study. We've done that for 11 years. And the latest study has New Jersey as the worst state, getting an F.
I'm supposed to chant, we're number 50?
They even beat out New Jersey. And keep in mind, these are numbers even before the pandemic. So our calculations is that the state needed more than $190 billion to pay its bills that it has accumulated to date. And each taxpayer's share divided by the number of taxpayers there in the state would be $57,900. Based upon your experience, Bobby, there in New Jersey, what were the underpinnings of this, poor financial condition? And also, can you also highlight, how the state, like all the states except for Vermont, have a balanced budget requirement? So how did they go into debt while quote, following this balanced budget requirement?
Okay, I'll try not to jump around too much, but I'll try to give it to you as condensed as possible. The 2 outstanding liabilities, obligations you point out, which are very substantial, have grown and accumulated like most things like this over time. One is the outstanding pension liability, and the other is the retiree health care outstanding obligations. And they are, as you said, about $190 billion together. They've grown over time. I'll go back in a little bit and give you a little history of that. But the other snapshots that go into this is the annual appropriations for certain responsibilities and obligations that don't necessarily deliver services. And those 2 that go into it are, we have $45 billion in capital debt. That's a pretty substantial portfolio when you consider that's greater than our highest or largest amount of budget. And we also have a pension contribution because of lack of contributions, the original pension bond deal from the 90s, where this year in this budget, whether you take the 9-month or accumulate it to the 12-month combined of the 3 and the 9, you've got almost $5 billion in pension contribution. And you've got almost, did I say billion? Yeah, almost $5 billion in pension contribution, and probably a little over in the area of $4 billion in just capital debt service. Well, that's almost $9 billion. That's essentially between 25 and 35%, whichever calculation you use, of the budget. You're not delivering one service. You're not doing anything other than maintaining a sort of treading water for the pension, let alone you're paying off capital debt that has grown a lot over the last decade. And so this is why borrowing, you can't borrow your way out of it. We've already borrowed.
Interrupt you, Bobby, just to make sure our listeners understand. So
sure.
What you're saying is there, we kind of equivocate the pension and retiree health care debt, kind of like somebody's credit card, where they've charged up compensation costs to those cards. Mm-hmm. And then what you're talking about, these contributions and the loan payments are almost like the monthly payments that the credit cards company says you have to pay. And those, no matter what, you've already got used all those goods and services. And now you're just stuck with paying these minimum contributions.
They expand your snapshot with annual contributions and obligations that take you from whatever, if you figure it out, some type of program to repay the 100 and the 80 or the 90 and the 80, it takes 25-30% of the annual budget appropriation to cover ongoing pension just to keep it afloat, because last year's return was like 1%, as well as the fact you've got capital debt service that exceeds the amount of the budget, and the debt service on it is about 10%. So you put those two together, you're out of pocket a lot before you open the books in a fiscal year to do anything.
So
So
that's before they
it's
can
basically affirming yours and showing that on an annual basis it's even greater.
And so that's before you provide any government services, before you provide any health care, before you provide
anything current and ongoing. Yeah.
Any school money, anything. You have to pay these underlying credit cards that the state's already stuck with.
Now there's another side to this, and this is where Cliff and I got started. New Jersey, from the decade of about 2010-ish to 2020, there were three, we called them Cliff's three drains, because they basically cost the state recurring sustainable revenues that were gone. One was lost through not my original creation, but the way they morphed into the tax credits and the Economic Opportunity Act of 2013. That is a very little is going to be netted back to the state. So that's basically funding more than it is a hold harmless, break even, or upside. You also have when they did the Transportation Trust Fund renewal, they raised the gas tax, which they needed to, but they did these tax cuts as offsets out of the general fund. And they were a sales tax cut of about, it went from like a quarter to a third of a penny, and they got rid of the estate tax. Together, at the time, they were worth about $1.2 billion. They were supposed to grow to about $1.4 billion. I wouldn't know how to quantify it today because the tax revenues on the sales tax side are certainly reduced because of the current situation. But basically what you had is the trust fund, which was supposed to be self-sustaining, self-renewing, and off-balance sheet tax source, the gas tax, was now being offset from the general fund. Basically, why'd you need a trust fund? Just go back to the general fund. I know that's a little bit facetious, but it's the wash. It's the no net gain, no real benefit. The other thing they did with the Transportation Trust Fund, they presupposed how much they were going to raise each year and created this 8-year program of $2 billion each. Well, that was fine, except with the indexing and the reduced usage even before the pandemic. And now they had to raise the gas tax almost a dime recently. So everybody's saying, well, our gas tax is too high. Well, it probably would have been better to fund it up front the first year and then sort of look at the year before and say, here's how much we can do. It's not the best way to do capital planning, but it keeps you in a tighter range of what you have to spend. The last thing was the borrowing. New Jersey borrowed about $10 billion for various things, some very worthy, but they borrowed about $10 billion for that decade. The previous administration, this administration, to where now you've got a $45 billion capital debt portfolio, which requires feeding every year to the tune of about $4 billion. So it's all that together of revenues lost, obligations take on, and obligations growing, where we have what I'll call the augmented truth in accounting snapshot. Because in the end, and this is what Cliff always said, it's breadcrumbs, dominoes, mosaic. Whatever dollar you raise and spend for this can't go to that. And whatever dollar you commit to something worthy, maybe something else worthy comes along and it's not there for that. So you just can't create magically new revenue, let alone eliminate obligations.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that fees, pension, and retiree health care and capital debt, minimum credit card payments are going up. At the same time, there were some mechanisms, some tax cuts, sales tax cuts, estate tax cuts, some tax credits that actually reduced the money coming in. So obviously, you have more money going out, but not as much money coming in. Again, all while saying that the budget is balanced. So now, all of that happened, and we have, had New Jersey as the worst state for a number of years. But then
You're
the
not going to hear
pandemic
me disagree with you, regardless of criteria or factors. You've got it. You nailed it. So
yeah, and then
there was
the pandemic hit, and
it went off the rails.
yeah. So how did that affect your state's budget process, including borrowing? Here in Illinois, the governor and the legislature, they're going to borrow to balance the budget. They're going to borrow $5 billion from the Federal Reserve has set up a mechanism because they can't go to the market and get the money. Their credit's not good enough. And then they're counting on, they balance the budget by counting on $2 to $3 billion from the federal government, which, those stimulus packages, the Congress can't even decide on, but they're still part of this balanced budget calculations. What did they do in New Jersey as this crisis hit with their budget?
You were on a roll. I was enjoying the captured moment of Illinois. You're number 49, not much better than 50 or 48. Anyway, that being said, what happened was there became this reality awareness in late March, and I'll give the governor credit, who came from he had a serious surgery, and instead of having any recuperation time, sort of had to take charge of this. I give him a lot of credit for that because he couldn't have felt well. I'm sure whatever he might have been prescribed pain medicine wise, he couldn't really take in order to be out front and be a leader. He did a good job of sort of taking control of the overall situation. But they also looked at this, I think the legislature, the governor's office, they looked at this and said, you know what? We don't know where this is going to end. We don't know how bad it's going to be. I mean, this is late March. You had the vibe of this could get bad and stay bad. Who really knew? So in early April, they basically said, look, we've got to buy time. We've got to just give ourselves a chance to see how bad is it. So what they did was they did a few extensions, which in the end probably weren't the worst thing to do, but by buying time, you just grew into it's worse. And what measures did we take to sort of be proactively saving it? They extended the income tax filing from April 15th, like the federal government did, to July 15th, to give everyone another 90 days worth of grace period. They also said, instead of having our budget be due June 30th to go into a July 1 to July 1 fiscal year, we're going to extend it 3 more months to the end of September, and we'll do a bridge budget, where you would ask, probably gets into some of the later stuff, a 3-month bridge budget. And that way we at least have a better handle on things. Well, as things are going forward, they're realizing this is getting worse. We're losing revenue, our costs are higher. That's a recipe for it's not working. Not that anybody else had any better situation or a better handle on it. So in late May, there was a responsibility when they did these extensions. We want a report from the treasurer. Where are we at? The snapshot. And basically it said, this is bad, could be getting worse, seems to be on some levels. So what they did was, in order to get into the constitutional requirement for the June 30th, now September 30th, basically they de-appropriated certain things. They moved things out into the September into October. And again, they bought time. Except when you buy time, all those dependent on you for funding at the state level for their operations, the local level, schools, colleges, they're all like, well, what are we going to get and when? Let alone what you owe us from, let's say, it was current ongoing in the spring for fiscal year 20. What's going to happen as we go forward toward the new bridge from 20 to 21? So everybody was in a wait and see. The problem with that is it's not only what you're not getting, when are we going to know what part of what we're not getting? So it stretched it out. They did the bridge budget. It was like $7.7 billion. And they felt like we can get through that. And it brings you have to do the budget August 25th. But in the midst of that, and there was a credit downgrade, and I believe there was also an outlook, a fiscal outlook downgrade from stable to negative. I don't remember which rating agencies, but the state was teeter-tottering from an outlook and an assessment standpoint. from the rating agencies, along with probably others. They decided we're going to try to borrow our way out of this. And I think it was more from the administration. The first bill they proposed, an assembly bill, 4175, basically set up to about a $14 billion borrow with various terms and conditions just that weren't viable, but it was sort of like, well, we'll do 5 GOs and we'll do 9 through the Federal Reserve or some combination thereof. Well, 14 billion, even if you need it, that's unrealistic. So it goes through the process, it passes the assembly. Now remember, their rationale to pay it back is we'll restore the sales tax cut and we'll put a surcharge on property taxes. New Jersey is whether famous, infamous, notorious, our property taxes are through the roof. How much more can you put on it? And in the end, you're telling the public you're going to bear the cost of all this. So that goes through its sort of progression into the Senate. They get their version. But at the same time, the administration strikes a deal with the public workforce. We're just going to delay any raises, bumps, increments you're going to get, and you're going to take some voluntary furlough days that you can use vacation time for. And most people have been in the public service that long. They have accrued vacation time, whatever is allowed, that they're allowed to carry over. So in the end, the savings was nominal at best, and yet the specter of raising property taxes, everybody in the public says, we're going to get our property taxes sort of like a bumped up mortgage.
Right.
Let alone on the local level, they're going to have their own issues, which I'll get to. When it goes to the Senate passes a better version, more streamlined. 9.9 billion was the amount. Now, intermittently, the governor said we may need 20, but again, nobody knows. It's educated guesstimates that in the end, you know during and at the end of it. I mean, you do fiscal modeling anymore, and you know if you're right as you go along and at the end. So that being said, they passed the bill, the governor signs it, even though around the same time he said, I think we're going to need more than this 9.9, and it was broken out as 2.7 into this fiscal year, 20, which was allowed to go to September 30th, the 3-month bridge period, as well as for the 9-month truncated, another 7.2. Well, they get challenged. Now, the challenge was based on constitutional issues. And without getting sort of boring and a long thing, there had been constitutional cases on borrowing in New Jersey back more toward the early 2000s into the more first decade of the 2000s. And basically these decisions said, you can't borrow money for operating expenses, although they let that one go through because it's already been done. You can't borrow through an entity that's separate from the state, almost like we call it contract debt, that the legislatures, you're going to pay it because you don't want to default. And at the same time, how much can you borrow as a percentage of the overall state budget and those considerations. Since then, they had got an opinion that they're allowed to do this with agencies that existed before the opinion. And as Cliff always said, they just keep doing end runs around the Constitution. Keeping that in the back of your mind.
Well, I thought maybe you said in runs around the Constitution.
No, end runs. Look,
it sounds to me like in runs where they had all these agencies that were not included.
I told you about that Philadelphia, South Jersey accent. No, Cliff used to say they're doing end runs around the Constitution. And their complaint that was filed by the minority party, by both the party as well as the minority legislative representatives, they based it on, this is unconstitutional. You can't do this. Now, that's pretty much saying, we know what's in the Constitution and previous decisions better than you do, Supreme Court. Now, anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world probably, you know what a Constitution says? Whatever that Supreme Court says it says. That's their job. Now, they're human beings too. So to say it's not an emergency, it doesn't matter what's defined. It's an emergency. but they put all their eggs in that basket of it's unconstitutional. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I've been through enough approaches of like this and facilitating legislation and project development and agreements. I would have looked at it a little differently. There was a codicil you'd call it, within the Senate version, which was a much better defined, balanced version of this borrowings bill. But it said, we're doing this to maintain and preserve the fiscal integrity of the state. That, to me, was the Achilles heel. That was the glaring thing that you could have said, here's a snapshot of using Sheila and Truth in Accounting's twofold snapshot, and let's even expand it to the stuff Bobby's saying. We're in a precarious situation. We can't afford to borrow our way out of this. I probably, if it was me, would have said, you want to do it as a constitutional violation? Okay, put in the fiscal integrity. That would have done two things. One, it might have kept it in Superior Court. And two, you might have been able to sort of eliminate the Constitution, because now you would have made the state accountable for its fiscal condition. Because Cliff always said, anything like this ever happens, two questions must get presented and asked. What'd you cut and what'd you raise? And the state hadn't done either one.
Right. So
they basically, again, back to the beginning, they're buying time without really creating any answers to the problems. So when the decision came out, the lead attorney for the plaintiff, they did it to a Zoom hearing like this, basically with a lot of questioning and follow-ups. The 7 members of the Supreme Court are very good, and some of them have legislative experience and worked in the Attorney General's office, that type of thing. They basically got this attorney to acknowledge it is an emergency, because the operative language was an emergency due to an act of God or a natural disaster. Whether it fits either of those categories or not, anybody's going to say it's an emergency. They're not going to go to their Webster's or whatever and get a definition, because there's an emotional side to this. I mean, they brought up people are dying, and the argument from the state was this is like the Civil War or the Depression, where we're allowed to use these extraordinary powers. And because of how they framed it, you couldn't challenge the state's position. What'd you cut? What'd you raise? What did you do to reconcile this April, May, June as it was deteriorating? So when the Supreme Court said they can do this, I wasn't surprised. And the Supreme Court put in their decision a line that I thought, just personally, and I've checked with a few others who thought the same, that applied to the case as it was presented. We're not here to comment on fiscal policy or budgeting issues. I don't think they were saying that generally, because what they were asked was, is it constitutional or not? And they said, yeah, it is. It's an emergency. They got to do what they got to do. And they recommended some limitations and guidelines and processes. So basically, by going in as a constitutional challenge, you let the state off the hook for being accountable for, as you say, the underpinnings that got you here.
Did the case, I didn't follow it as close as you did. Did it just go based upon the debt provisions of the Constitution? Or did it cover any of the balanced budget part of the Constitution?
It sort of covered a little of all, but basically it addressed the debt provisions. But the real key thing was it an emergency or not? So when you get into that, you're basically, the Supreme Court, at least the way I looked at it, they were giving themselves a waiver on the previous decisions. Different court, mostly different members, different time and place, different circumstances. And since the state had gotten a legal opinion that said, we can still do contract borrowing and for greater, and we'll stay with the smaller amount, but it allowed the waiver for the Supreme Court to be justified because of the emergency. And what the minority kept saying was, and the plaintiff was, no, it doesn't, until finally their own attorney said, yeah, it's an emergency. Well, that ball game, that was it. I was torn. I didn't know if I wanted the state to win or not, because by winning, they could borrow this $9.9 billion. We'll get into why they can't afford that later. By losing, you lost 3 or 4 months of what Cliff said. What'd you cut? What'd you raise?
Right.
Cliff was a real meat and potatoes type of person. He just looked at everything as a T-chart, and they had to balance out because that's what the state constitution called for. So basically, to answer your original question, no, New Jersey probably hasn't had a balanced budget in decades because, as Truth in Accounting so aptly pointed out, 100 billion plus 90 billion, that's not a balanced budget. But that's a credit card that gets pretty heavy after a while, which
Yeah.
you're right, could be growing. So that basically was the outcome. But there was
that
one thing.
3-month budget, the 3-month budget, they, didn't propose any, slicing and dicing or raising any revenue. Again, it would be, take it to a personal level, during this crisis, households are in trouble. So you don't go out to dinner. You try to have your food bill be the least it can. You're taking out as many expenses as you can. You're thinking about taking a second job if you could. But the state, instead of doing those things, just said, okay, I'm going to take out another credit card. I'm going to borrow even more.
And all they did in the spring was, like May into June, was deappropriate. I had never heard that word before.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What does deappropriate mean?
Deappropriate means we appropriated in the budget we are living within, but we're going to take it back, or we're going to push it out to hit the calendars of, the 3-month budget and the next 9-month budget. So it was almost like a buy time carryover, because eventually most of these deappropriations and delays, they were going to have to address.
Right.
You weren't going to leave schools and towns and colleges hung out to dry, but you might give them less, or they might get less of what they were owed from the fiscal year 20 budget. So again, it bought time, but didn't resolve anything. And if anything,
the next budget, obviously that lasted until September 30th. So now we're 8 days right now into October. What happened with the next 9-month budget now?
Yeah, you asked about that. And the 9-month budget, the governor was required on August 25th to deliver a budget. And he did. But when you take what he delivered in size, total dollar amount, and added it to the 3-month bridge budget, as I like to refer to it, you had the same $40 billion number he gave you back in February. Now, there might have been some worthy things added. He proposed new taxes, but in the end, nothing got resolved. And I can break down the things that ended up getting added back in and the taxes they raised, but from an effectual standpoint, nothing really changed. And I think they lost the 2.7 because that fiscal year passed. And unless that's part of this 4.5 billion borrowings that's pending, that 2.7 evaporated in September 30th. I don't know, because what they posted as like the proposal to the committee of 4, which is the legislative committee as part of the S2697, which was the approved borrowings bill, they only said we're going for 4.5. I would have tried to get to 2.7 and carried it over somehow, even if I needed a legal opinion, and then taken 1.8 so that I left myself as much as possible for the unknown down the road.
Yeah.
So
now, if you and Cliff, let's just say, we had that quote dream team back in the
that's Cliff. I'm the water boy. I'm the manager.
Back in the treasurer's office. What do you think he and his team would have suggested to get through the current crisis?
I think Cliff would have looked at everything. What do I have to do to keep the state operating? What do I have to do for the towns, school districts, colleges, all the what we'll call dependent parties for state funding? And I think Cliff at that point would have probably said, the state in New Jersey, let's use the 40 billion as a number. 9 to 10 is for state operations to run the departments. And that doesn't include debt service nor the pension contribution we talked about. I think Cliff would have probably looked at it and said, we can't afford 9+ billion. We got to make it 6, 5, 8, 6, 2, whatever. We've got to stop being. My complaint always was to Cliff from when I first met him, all the way through our knowing each other. New Jersey got too parental from the late 80s into the 90s. They wanted to control everything with the school districts, the towns. They couldn't take care of their own business. How are they to tell the kids, as the way they looked at it, what to do? And you made the towns and the school districts keep coming to Trenton like an Oliver Twist, taking their hat off, saying, may I have more, please, because their costs were going up. And in New Jersey, for the most part, all localities have is property taxes. Yeah, they've got parking revenue and court fees and a little hotel tax that was eventually added. But in the end, they live on property taxes. We don't have local purpose taxes the way they do in a lot of localities and a lot of states. So I think Cliff would have taken a more drastic measure, because I think Cliff would have realized this is bad, even if it gets better. It's not going to get fully better, and not for a long time. So if you want, I can sort of take you through a little of the August 25th budget, what they proposed and what it turned out as, what was just signed. But they did, the governor proposed a millionaire's tax for the third time, and he did finally get it. That raises about $390 million. He extended the corporate business tax surcharge for a longer period. It was supposed to sunset. That's another 210. And he added on to the levy on healthcare plans that now raise 100. So there's $700 million. There's a couple problems with that. First of all, once it takes effect, even if it's immediately, which it isn't, they've promised a taxpayer rebate program next August for $340 million. And once the debt service kicks in from this, the debt service at 3% on $4.5 billion, that was the other thing. The legislature went from his $4 billion on August 25th to 4.5. There was a discrepancy between the revenue projections from the OLS, Office Legislative Services, and the administration, so they sort of split the difference. That $4.5 billion over 12 years that they're proposing, it's almost $500 million a year. So basically, you didn't gain anything. Where's the net upside?
Yeah, and isn't it, what again, taking it back to a personal level, is the state getting to the point where, yeah, it's charging things to its credit card, it's getting more and more debt, and they're looking at the minimum payments, but it sounds like to me that the minimum payments are getting to the point where they're not going to be even able to pay those minimum payments.
I think part of why they went for the borrowings, and I guess worried about the debt service and impact later, because according to the governor, they were virtually running out of money. They were running out of the ability to pay bills. I think I would have gone after a more short-term solution of some type of line of credit with regional banks, maybe do really short-term notes if that was allowable under the previous constitutional challenges and allowability. But I think there were other ways to cure the short term while you took on the big picture of, as Cliff would say, you got to cut, you got to raise, and you got to find efficiencies. But they didn't allow themselves that opportunity. Look, it's a big lift. But you know what? States have had constitutional conventions. States have had major overhauls. You didn't get in this pickle quickly. You're not getting out of it quickly. But unless you start, you won't know. And you know what? We have an expression. The only heavy lift is one that isn't tried.
Wouldn't this be a good time, and people might be accepting, obviously there are people in need and there are certain cuts that can't happen, but wouldn't people be more willing to, cut things? It's like, hey, we're in crisis. We're really having struggles here. We're going to have, we can't, what can we do? We're going to have to cut something. Do you think people would be willing during this time or not?
I would hope that when we get to my Cliff-based, inspired, and blessed, all three, sort of balanced plan B alternative to borrowings, I would hope they'd say, this is fair, this is reasonable, it's balanced, it's spreading it out, the responsibility and the accountability. Look, I was a state worker, and I can understand no one wants to lose their job or their seniority or whatever. But the reality is the state hasn't been able to afford the budgets they've put forward for a long time. The state can't afford a $40 billion budget. So that the 9 to 10 billion in operations has to be substantially less, or at least significantly less. When they did the Supreme Court hearing, the DAG, who did a very nice job, said, well, we can't solve this. We'd have to cut 70% of the state operating budget. And that was accurate, except no one could challenge saying, well, that's part of it should go there. Part of it should be restructuring all the indebtedness. Part of it should be looking at the pension situation. Part of it should be finding other ways to provide resources for the localities. It's a smorgasbord where you got to put a little of everything on your plate. Maybe it's only a spoonful, but everything has to be on the table. And you just can't go back to the citizens saying you're going to repay it.
It sounds almost like, I hate to say, they took the easy route. Instead of making these structural changes that would bring, the budget maybe even into balance for the long haul, we'll just borrow. We'll borrow our way out of it again. They just kick the can down the road some more.
When we first came up with the 3 drains, I said, all right, Cliff. And that was before Cliff got ill. And I said, now we got to come up with a solution. He said, why? I said, well, you don't identify problems without figuring out how to solve them. He said, do we have to? I said, you're Cliff Goldman. You're a fiscal titan. Yeah, we got to do that. He was like, all right. And we went through these preliminary exercises of 3 R's: reforms, reductions, revenues, that they have to be a compilation. I think part of it was, Sheila, that I think the state kept limping along year to year. They would throw out the numbers that you pointed out, but never really address them. Even if you don't totally resolve it, you got to address them. They're not going away. And between the carrying cost and the obligations growing, forget going over the fiscal cliff. I think we're beyond the precipice. I think we already went off it without a parachute. You've got to take this on big picture.
Well,
and
one way that they do this is again, they kind of circumvent the intent of balanced budget requirements. The intent of, there's 2 major intents of balanced budget requirements. One, to not go into debt, and then 2, so you can hold the elected officials accountable. So when, tax dollars come in and then they spend those. Well, obviously, if you spend more than the tax dollars and you have to raise taxes, taxpayers get upset. But by not having to raise tax dollars because they're hiding the true cost of government, they kind of circumvent the balanced budget requirements. Is there anything that could be done to shore up the wording of the balanced budget requirement so they couldn't do this borrowing and the pension shenanigans?
First of all, this goes back, if you listen to the other podcasts, which you said you did, when the interviewer asked me about, well, how did all these credit downgrades and negative outlooks start? I said, you got to go back like 40 years ago, as Cliff was finishing being the treasurer in the early 80s, that the state had a small surplus, but we weren't, like a lot of places, we weren't out of the down 1970s. They raised all the taxes because they couldn't agree on which one. The economy got better. And through the 80s, New Jersey made a lot of great investments, did a lot of great things, but they all cost. So that by the time Governor Kane was leaving office and Governor Florio came in, the state was in a hole because the outlook was too rosy, and it came in less from 1989 into 1990. Governor Florio dealt with the schools issue, the Supreme Court challenge of fair and equal education, and also with the property tax issue. In the end, most people did better with his tax package, but all people knew was I forget what the total number was, but 2.8 billion raised on toilet paper, and then the anti-gun control factored into it, and it just became chaotic to the point where he lost a very close election. And the next governor decided, I kept the promise, I'm going to cut the income tax, but in order to pay for it, did a pension bond deal, which basically said the stock market's good. We're going to borrow the money, invest it, and hope for a return that's at least equal or better than the taxable interest rate of 7%. That didn't work. We're still paying for it today. I think about
Right.
500 million a year.
Right.
Over time, it was kicking the can down the road to where the can left the street, the town, the county, might even have gone across the river. And that's what happened. It just grew over time, where no one wanted to have the fiscal reality therapy that I'm suggesting now. And, you know, it's unfortunate. If Cliff was here, I would have prepped him a couple times and this would have been out there because he was Cliff Goldman. I'm not.
Yeah. You know, so what would Cliff do going, you know, how would he get out of the current and long-term problem?
The first thing is, I think Cliff is the guy that created the New Jersey income tax to fund schools and provide property tax relief. They have a bill that passed and was approved for the localities, the towns, the school districts, they're allowed to borrow. I think they have 10 years to repay it. But here's the problem. The borrowing is to address lost revenue but in a lot of cases not the or, increased costs. Well, you're borrowing for a problem that's still going on with no specific end in sight.
Right.
You're not giving the towns any new resources, no revenue sources, no tax resources, nothing new to actually pay the debt service. And while fiscal aid from the state may be sort of level this year, I have one word for fiscal year 21. Whoa. Because you don't have the borrowed money, let alone whatever taxes you raise, you got to pay debt service. So there's no upside, let alone the taxpayer rebate. And again, it's falling back on property taxes. I know that's my sort of broken record theme, but that's where they're all sort of dumping it on. I think Cliff would have looked at this more holistically. And I think he would have said, okay, what do we got to do on a variety of levels? Part of the problem is, over the years, I noticed it in the early 90s, it's only gotten more. New Jersey, again, they got very parental. They have these departments that oversee so much of what the localities do. Well, you know what? You can't take care of your own business. You can't afford these oversight entities and control entities. You ever think maybe eliminate them and create maybe people like Cliff, a small team that can go out to the towns and the school districts and help them with whether it's a bond financing, whether it's balancing their budget, whether it's appropriating, whatever it is, provide the guidance and the leadership, but you can't have a bigger bureaucracy than what it is you're overseeing singularly, let alone collectively. Yeah. And that's the reform part. That's the reform part of state government. State government got too big and too costly. It's not the only thing, because 75%, 80% goes out the door. But you also have to give towns, localities, I say localities, towns, school districts, you got to give them revenue capacity other than property taxes. And I don't think it's necessarily taxes because New Jersey's taxed out, but you got to give them revenue opportunities where they can be self-sufficient and not have to come hat in hand to Trenton, hoping they're going to get enough each budget cycle.
Well, again, we talked about the balanced budget, wording, and, to me, and I'm hoping you have an answer to this.
I'll try.
To me,
we are going far afield, but this is okay.
To me, it sounds like you're saying that with the political environment and the citizens wanting more and more.
Well, some of it is need too. Your costs go up. So
yeah, your costs go up, and obviously, since you're not taxing the people, for this additional cost, you're obviously going into debt, and and you're saying, you mentioned that one of the governors, had tried to do some quote fiscally responsible things, and he got voted out of office. So to me, it sounds like we're going to be in trouble, and we're going to stay in trouble. Is there any way out that people are going to be fiscally responsible, or are politicians going to continue to use the budget to, in essence, buy votes, i.e. we're going to provide you all these services and benefits, but we're not going to tax you adequately?
Let alone $400 million worth of, they call them Christmas trees, which are sort of locally beneficial grants. That got added in. I didn't go from the August 25th to what got passed in as much detail, but that was a point of contention and sort of public discourse that they added $400 million of Christmas trees that we can't afford. Not that they're not worthy to the towns, counties, schools, whoever got them. You can't afford it. You can't pay your own bills. How can you be giving it away in grants to other entities? Here's what I think needs to happen. First of all, the towns and the school districts can only reduce so much. The state has to reduce its overall operational size. Now,
I just want to stop you.
Sure.
Would the public be willing to accept that, do you think?
You know, I think if you can keep their property tax increases more reasonable and nominal, try to keep level the taxes they pay, I think they'd be willing to go for, and I'll get into this, new revenue sources that aren't taxes, but are small revenue sources. But I think they look at the state and say, you can't take care of your own house. Why are you criticizing mine? Let alone I got to come to you to repair my house. I noticed in the early 90s, New Jersey is too parental. New Jersey's funding, budgeting, and taxing is like a recycling program. It all comes to State Street through Trenton, we used to call it through the Gold Dome, and then they send it back. Well, that's fine, but sometimes the parent opens the wallet. They ain't got enough allowance for the kids or whoever else they're paying bills, whatever, to. New Jersey needs a measured overhaul of the overall fiscal framework, budgeting, taxing, funding. And that includes their relationship with the localities, the schools, and the towns. And they've got to give them resources, different kinds of revenues to be able to be self-sufficient and self-determinant. You can't do everything to and through a state government. And I've talked to other states where they said, yeah, we have a 7% sales tax. Well, where does it go? Well, 4 goes to the state, 1 stays in the county for roads and infrastructure, for schools, another penny goes toward like entertainment, attractions, parks. So it filters down from the county. I think if New Jersey would look at revenues creatively and let them filter down and stay in the county, and you can equalize them where some counties have more commercial or more opportunity, you could find the balance to have it start to address and resolve the immediate, intermediate, and long-term obligations. Because right now, come next spring when they start next fiscal year, and let's face it, this $4.5 billion, that's the initial tranche. Whatever they've got left, whether the 2.7 is gone or not, or 4.5 subtract from 7.2, nothing says they can't go out with that again. So you're going to have this bigger borrowing. All you're doing is delaying the pain, which next year, an election year no less, will be very painful. And I think my own assessment, the schools and the towns are going to take it on the chin. Because the state, between their own operations, which they haven't reduced, pension obligation, to keep the pension afloat, you're going to have to put a like number in. It's 4.7. The governor wanted 4.9. They put in 4.7. And you're going to still have debt service, let alone your other operational costs. So you know what? What did you resolve? Everybody was like going crazy. Oh, we got a millionaire's tax. To what end? Right. Well, baby steps. I hate that phrase. You can't chip away at something that's this major. You got to overhaul it. And I think what the state's going to have to do, instead of looking at taxes, you're going to have to look at revenue sources. I call them transactional and purchase pennies, TAPs. You're going to have to look for pennies, a penny, 2 cents, 3 cents. Hopefully you start with things that are not taxed, and they become a little more eligible in the transaction. And even if you have to change the dynamics of what tax to reduce the tax, you're going to have to find, David Letterman had a great phrase. How do we do it? Volume, volume, volume. Well, that's what you're going to, I like pop phrases. You're going to have to do it that way. They're going to have to come up with the pennies that incrementally and collectively matter more than the taxes everyone's so resistant to. And I actually, to me, give the localities a chance. Can they do any worse than what the state's done?
Yeah.
Did that give you sort of a?
Oh, yeah, no, that gives it. We have just a little bit more time.
Sure.
What can the listeners do to help address New Jersey? Is there something, an
What I'm
individual?
hoping is that through your gracious hosting me and truth in accounting, boy, there's an apt phrase. I mean, this is truth, justice, the American way, as Superman. Well, not Superman, but this is the public needs to hear the truth. And I really think if the public, through your site, through hopefully other entities picking this up in the media and other groups, the public will know, you know what? Maybe this guy knows what he's talking about. Maybe Sheila asked good questions. And maybe there's a more balanced, practical, applicable way that can work. Not just to limp us one year to the next, but actually try to address the bigger picture problems and put us on a sound road to fiscal stability. You can't spend what you don't have, and the state has been spending what they haven't had for so long. I don't think they recognize balanced budget. It's a misnomer. I'll leave it at that. We haven't had a balanced budget for probably closer to 3 decades.
Yeah, and so that reminds me, people, as you mentioned, could go to our dataz.org website. You can click on New Jersey and get just their financial state of New Jersey. I apologize, it's not a pretty picture, but the truth has to be told. And Bobby, I really appreciate you telling us the truth here today and letting the listeners know, how the state may be able to get out of its crisis besides borrowing. And people can go to our theta-z.org website or our truthinaccounting.org website to learn more. Thank you so much, Bobby.
Thanks a lot. Cliff assigned this to me. I hope I finally delivered to his revered memory.
I think you have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sheila. I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.